Hello, aloha, everyone. My name is
Hi.
Kimberly. Hi, Kathy. My name is
Buenas
Kimberly.
noches.
Buenas noches, buenas tardes. um, Hello, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are on the planet. My name is Kimberly Miguel Mullen. Today is a very special day for me because with me I have a very special guest for our Dance Art Life interview series. These are conversations with thriving creatives, people who are experts in the field at what they do, who are working full-time creatives at their passions, fulfilling their passions. What better person to have on this program than one of my dearest mentors, one of the people that really was the first person in my career that really showed me that doing this was possible. This woman is my first Afro-Caribbean dance teacher. I'm not gonna cry because these are just, it's tears of joy, really. But if you all know me, any of my students who know me have heard me talk about this woman forever, and I always bring her with me wherever I go in the world, and now she's here with me to share with us her knowledge, her wisdom, her expertise. Welcome, Kathy. This is Catherine Evleshin, everyone. She is Dance Pioneer, Dance Ethnologist Pioneer.
What a wonderful introduction. And just to clarify, I am not active in the field anymore because of my advanced age, but this has made me move into social dance, which is what I'm really wanting to focus on now. So we're talking about the African diaspora and Latin American dance, and with a heavy emphasis on the social dance, nightclub scenes and that kind of a thing, but I'll also address some other stuff. So you want me to launch into some topics?
Yeah, absolutely. We are a few minutes late, so yeah, let's just launch in. I do want to preface the conversation by acknowledging that the topic about what we're going to talk about is a little bit tweaked from the actual title that was presented to you all in the Facebook events page, and what I discussed yesterday in the video. And so I want Kathy to clarify exactly kind of the direction of where we're going today.
Well, I thought of it as dancing with the other or with others, and dancing, semicolon, dancing for others. And I really wanted to make a subtitle that old saw to hiding in plain sight. So it has to do with what is communicated and to whom and for what purpose. And especially in more the amateur thing. So I'm not going to go into, there are many directions this could go, but I'm taking it from the point of view of amateurs and in the Latin American, focusing on Cuba primarily, but not exclusively. So anyway, that's where we're at. So do you want me to launch into
Perfect.
some topic?
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. I'd like to bring up the first point of style for Africans and African diaspora. I'll just say Africans from now on, because African diaspora is a big mouthful, but I'm not talking about Africa. I'm talking about as it developed in the Western Hemisphere. And so this focus and ability for Africans to move in synchrony and don't have to move a whole lot because it's done right within, they don't jump around. They can, but in terms of social dance and in terms of groups watching a soloist, they will still move because they're doing it with their torso. And the other good thing about this is something they can do on into advanced age. So everybody's involved. It's multi-generational. Europeans have a different style of dancing traditionally. And when they, in the situation in the Western Hemisphere, they appropriated the African style, but oftentimes changed it or sort of danced formlessly or sort of missed the point or created in another way, which was more in tune with the European style, which meant that there wasn't as much body isolation or it was different. So things changed. And I like to focus on this business of what is communicated, that you and I were talking about how dance is just as good as language is as far as expressing ideas.
If not better.
Sometimes better, yes. And points of view and feelings and all that. And so it's expressivity. But in the situation that Africans found themselves, it was often that they were in a repressive environment where it was they had to hide what they really felt, and sometimes hide what they really wanted to do, but they made it work. So they were able to communicate among themselves and kind of keep it a separate language for the enemy, really, you know, who was their master or somebody who had more power than they did, who was oppressing them. So the first area that I'd like to go into is festival culture, because, okay, festivals, we're talking about carnival, it has a bunch of different names, but it was oftentimes the only day of the year they had free. And it was oftentimes the only day of the year that they had where they could express African culture. So it was a very important day to them. And they would, so for them, what the images that they had in carnival, and to this day have a very deep meaning often for them, because they still have maintained some elements of the African culture. So the symbols they recognize, and they dance for each other, those symbols. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes other people don't even know what they're expressing. And this is exactly what they want, is they want to have two audiences. Or that's what they had to have in the past, and to some degree still do, because of course there's still all this conflict with groups, racial conflicts basically, but not just racial, it's a lot of stuff as we know. So anyway, that was the, so then what were Europeans doing during these carnivals? Now, festivals and carnivals abound in Africa, and they also abound in Europe, and abound pretty much everywhere in the world. So to say, where did a particular carnival element come from? You might say, well, it came from Europe, or it came from Africa, or it came from both, or it came from India sometimes, you know, whatever. And so, the Europeans, because of their needs, carnival was often a time when they could release inhibitions, and to this day. So they escape the sexual hang-ups that, or restrictions or strictures that they've had. And so so for them often, this is not entirely, but it shades when you see white or those people in Latin America who identify as white, they will often be doing a style that is, as I said, much less torso stuff and much more jumping around and much more licentious activity. Whereas,
are you speaking about a certain European group?
Pardon me?
Are you talking about a certain European group?
Well, not necessarily. There are Europeans, for example, in United States and in Brazil, there are areas where people do German dances, you know. But I'm talking about how evolved within, let's say, Brazilian culture, where see, so there's a white style of carnival and there is a black style of carnival. Now that doesn't mean if you're looking at a carnival group, they might be all kinds of colors in the group. It has to do with what style that they prefer and what they identify doing, and it's the music. The music is different too. It's much less African when those who identify as white are doing it. So two different styles. And then more importantly, for my thesis here, is that what is being conveyed and why are they doing it? In other words, we know this, the Mardi Gras in New Orleans, you know, the show your tits thing and stuff. So there are various symbols in these carnivals that express licentiousness or what they consider licentiousness. And also it has a lot to do with the breaking out the boundaries of gender. So oftentimes carnival is a time when LGBT has a freer reign than they do in other times of the year, or it's allowed to be in the street where it wouldn't be some other time. So that's another way of sort of escaping the strictures of their culture.
It's really interesting for me to kind of try to wrap my mind around the Europeans or the colonials who are the repressors are also feeling liberated by Carnival as well. I never thought of it that way.
Oh, definitely.
I mean, I've always just thought of it as, the liberation and emancipation of Africans, and that one time of year when the Africans, were able to exercise a little bit of freedom. But I never thought about it in the context of what you're putting it with the Europeans also expressing some levels of freedom inside their own, that they themselves are also experiencing certain levels of repression and limitations.
Right. And in fact, I would say much of what you see in Carnival is, if it's at the African end of the spectrum, it's much more serious. They will do material from the sacred realm and put it out on the street.
Right.
And because it's the only time they can. And
right.
It means a great deal to them. Whereas with, you don't see in this kind of particular festival I'm talking about, you don't see Catholic symbology. There are other festivals that happens, but I'm talking about the kind where,
okay, yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah, you and I have both done Trinidadian Carnival. Mm-hmm. And I've experienced Brazilian Carnival. I've never been to New Orleans. But what would you say, do you want to comment about those particular carnivals? And I've also done Cuba. Well,
everyone, and I've done Haiti and Panama, and everyone has its own particular styles and music, and it's related to their particular culture. But just so it's not the place here, I think, to go into the particulars about all those different carnivals, because they all do have the characteristics that I described.
They do. Yeah, absolutely.
And it isn't just African versus European, because, for example, in Trinidad, we know that, the Asian cultures are represented in Trinidad, and therefore in the carnival too. So I'd like to move on to the partner dancing realm, because that's so prevalent. And partner dancing, of course, came primarily from Europe. It had to do, and didn't even exist in Europe until women were given some freedom to choose their partners. And then it became a matter of seduction. So how seduction is dealt with in the various European versus African, of course, is so different. And the Europeans tend to be much different in the manner of seduction, but it was all about seduction. And so I I had to bring out one of yours and my favorite dances, the Rumba complex, and point out that in this Rumba Wawanko, there is a gesture where the man is pursuing the woman, and he's trying to thrust some part of his body toward her groin, and she's going to cover and deflect and, you know, brush him off. So this Rumba Wawanko is so outrageous the first time anybody sees it. I've had students who've dropped my class, feminists who said, this is ridiculous. I am not going to do this, you know, with a stranger in on the class. So the clash of the 20th century feminist movement, which did a number on partner dance. There was a time in this country where whites and blacks danced partner dancing. It was based mostly on African forms. I'm talking about jitterbug and that kind of a thing. And it was lead and follow. And that's what you had to do. The woman had to follow the lead. And so then in the 60s, when feminism came along, it was sort of like, I don't want to do that anymore. You know, I'm not going to lead. I'm not going to let this guy lead me around. So that was a major change. And fortunately, since we've moved along in feminism, we can now go back and do that. For one thing, now we have lead and follow rather than male and female. So the lead and follow in the club situation, it can be women to men, a man and woman. The woman might decide to do the leading for a while. It's much freer because our general culture has become much freer about gender role. So we can now do partner dancing and not worry about gender so much. But it's still a lot of the same old thing. You know, we're still, for the most part, we are sexual creatures, and for the most part, most of us are doing it in the traditional way. But it's not obligatory anymore.
Right.
The other thing I wanted to, the other thing I want to bring out in terms of partner dancing, because the United States has just been doing partner dance for a long time. And so what came in partner dancing, the whole business of competition. And I see this as done two ways. And if you think about, we know this, you know, jazz music, where the musicians express that, okay, I'm not going to compete with rules that you've made up. I am going to take inspiration from someone or group or whatever, and then I'm going to create my own style. And that's obligatory. That's kind of an African aesthetic, is that you do your thing. It doesn't mean you do it out of the blue with no style, no reference to the style that has been defined for the particular form. It's that you have to put your stamp on it. That doesn't come very naturally to the European mind. It's more like, okay, we're going to make these rules, you know, like Dancing with the Stars, you know, you're going to make these rules, and then everybody's going to try their best to get the prize, you know, because it's competitive.
Okay, so choreography versus improvisation.
Okay, well, well, let me just go on a little bit more on some other points, and then I'll get to the choreography, because it certainly does fit there. And in terms of competition, we know that a lot of these competitions are highly choreographed. And let's just wait on that hold that thought about choreography, because I want to get into what happened in the dances. This is partly because ballrooms are crowded, and the musicians got to be very presentational, and so they will move and look good and react with the audience. And so there's this, I call it the stand and sway audience, you know. So people, even, I mean, I've gone to Miami, like in the 80s, and not everybody was dancing all the time. There would be some dancing, but there would be a lot of stand and sway. And if you go to a white dance or a dance that is in that aesthetic, pretty much everybody's standing and swaying or wiggling a little bit, but they're not dancing with each other. They are, it's a group thing, but they are not relating in the same way that the partner dance, which is such an intense relational experience.
Right.
Even when the partners, they can be dancing and they know well enough that there are a whole bunch of people over there watching them. And so they're also having an audience, but they're also doing a lot of stuff with each other, which is the same thing going back to the rumba wawanko, you know, that just because the man is pursuing the woman and doing this gesture that's so obscene to Europeans when they first see it, wonderful after you get used to it, and they are presenting to the audience, and they are also relating with each other. So
right.
So then when you're talking about choreography, I see this happening now because, well, of course, there's always been what you do with tourists and what you do with people from the outside who are watching. And so we have a lot of, let's say, if you look at endless YouTubes of Cubans dancing in the street, and they're doing choreographies, and they're doing them for the camera because the audience is now anonymous. It can be anywhere in the world. Or maybe not because, but that's the way it's evolved. They're doing it for themselves too. But for the most part, they are very aware that they have an audience that they don't know who that audience is, and they're trying to look good for the camera. And so that has been a really big change that I see happening, is this anonymous audience that didn't exist before. Before, we had, people went to dances. The musicians always told me they were inspired and they watched all the dancers. The dancers watched each other when they were sitting out. And so it was a presentational thing, but it was also very much and I didn't say was, it still is. If you go to a salsa dance now, it's still very much an interactive thing, and it's the couple is still oftentimes the main relational thing, or the main interactional thing that you're going to look at, or that you're going to know that that's what it's about. It's how the two of them are seducing, you know, it's back to the seduction thing.
Right.
So back to choreography, rueda, casino rueda, which is the form where the various partners form a circle, and then they do, like square dancing, they do steps in unison with a caller who is one of the dancers, who calls out, it's generally a man, but not necessarily, who calls out what they're going to do. And then they all in unison do these wonderful sequences and steps, and then they change partners. So this rueda is the wheel, you know, and so that's what it is. They're going around the wheel with these very intricate, complicated steps. Now, is that choreography or not? Because the guy is calling it, but it's
right, and they're changing partners.
And so it's choreography in that he or she, the caller, is dictating what's happening, rather than the people inventing their own. Like if a man and a woman are dancing on a dance floor, he leads, or one of them leads, one of them follows, and the choreography it's an improv based on what the lead calls, you know, and not nonverbal. In the case of rueda, it's actually verbal. They call out, and everybody has to know the name of the steps. I can't do it away though, because I can't hear the callers for one thing. And the other thing, I don't like to take orders from people, you know. It's like, I came here, I've done choreography all my life in other situations, and I much prefer the improv that goes on these days in the dance clubs. And that's, to me, is going out, and I think most people are that way, is they like to feel the freedom of improvisation.
Right.
So what's next?
Can we talk about feminism a little bit?
Sure.
So Rumba Wawanko being a feminist nightmare. But is there a way that we can look at it where it's, because my experience of Rumba Wawanko from a Westerner's perspective is that, yeah, it's horrific at first when you, then now that I dance Wawanko and, I'm immersed in the culture, I don't see it at all. I actually see this as a feminist movement.
I agree. So
let's
do
clarify. Can we clarify?
Pardon me?
Yeah, let's clarify
let's
that.
talk about that, because the thing is, okay, the man is the one that initiates this groin movement, or this, this suit of the woman.
A provocative gesture.
Pardon me? A provocative, yeah.
Yeah.
And so how she responds is her power. She can, brush him off and that was weak, you go away, or she can even do it back to him, so she has a tremendous amount of power too. And then the different forms of Rumba, because there's the Yambu, which is sort of done by and representing older people. And in that case, they say the woman is in charge, and oftentimes it's a woman solo. Now, I don't see it so much as the woman being entirely in charge, but it's certainly the relationship there is much more equal than it is in Wawanko. And then the other form of Rumba is Rumba Columbia, which is a man's dance.
Right.
It's all about male competition, except these days women are starting to do it, and they're starting to do it very well. So feminism has come to Latin American cultures as well.
Right. It's just an interesting perspective on feminism and how the roles, the power roles, are, again, hiding in plain sight. In a certain way, even in that context, where the woman, it appears that the man has all the control, but really the woman is the one they're trying to pursue, so it's really her call at the end of the day.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's the way they view it. So when they see us getting all huffy about it, and leaving the class and all that, they say, what is wrong with, what is wrong? Can't you expand your definition of power to include what's going on there in this relationship, which is still a seduction? So the seduction's kind of got a bad rap these days, especially these days, and the politics, and the man can't put his hand on near a woman, without getting sued or whatever. And it's I'm just looking at all this with horror, because it's sort of like, this is not the world I grew up in. But the thing is, we knew how to handle ourselves. Not every, we're not talking about violent, transgressions. We're talking about interplay of males and females. And of course there's workplace issues where this should be kept out of the workplace pretty much.
Yeah.
But it's getting to really horrify me how touchy, how non-touchy women are getting with what's going on with men. And so it's like, if I were a man these days, I would be afraid to even, I'd walk with my hands in my pockets or something, so that nobody would accuse me of something. So anyway, back at the salsa club, seduction is live and well.
Right. I wanted to talk about, you did mention competition as well, and that kind of being a marker of European influence, right? And I mean, I don't even know if this is relatable, but when I was writing my master's thesis, and I was talking to Juan Carlos Blanco, who lives down in San Diego, from Raíces Profundas, we talked about the difference between competition. I mean, and I think I know what you were saying is quite different, because we're talking about, in the context of colonialism. But when we talked about competition, it's just interesting, the Cuban kind of mentality around competition, and in regards to Rumba Colombia, and how there's this competition between the men, because it's traditionally a male dance, and how he was saying that, they're competing against each other, the men. So there is a sense of competition inside of the context of Rumba Colombia. But he said the difference is that the two men who are competing against each other are trying to push each other and elevate each other to do to be better, right? And they're upping the ante. They're pushing each other to up the ante. So, and then eventually they come to knives, right? That's kind of like the full, like if you've ever seen like a Rumba Colombia, and you see the guys pull out the knives, and then the next even further, they'll blindfold themselves, right? Because right, this is a demonstration of masculinity too, right? So he says, it's really interesting, because my experience is that, competition here in the States is like one person's trying to squash the other person, versus like where I come from, he's like, I love his perspective, is that we're pushing each other to be better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And instead of establishing strict rules and, okay, have you met this rule? It's more like, where's your inventiveness? It's about invention.
Right.
And so if you can do something that nobody else has thought of, that still fits within the form and style, then you win.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And which is really great that you use the word to invent, because that is a word, inventar, something that's deeply embedded in the Cuban culture, and how they've had to invent, they're masters at inventing and inventions, right? As a part of becoming a sustainable and culture and resourceful culture, using the materials that they have, to
and we understand this in terms of jazz music and a lot of the musical forms in the United States, but somehow or other, white point of view on dance never got to that. It's sort of more doing it according to a form specific, and not so much with invention. Now, I know that back, if you look at the 40s of the white people dancing in the mambo in the clubs and everything, it was inventive. So it came and went, this inventiveness. But when I see all these competition shows, on the TV, it drives me crazy, because the technique is impeccable,
right?
But they're not expressive.
Right.
They just do tricks.
Right.
In my perspective, they're doing a lot of brilliant tricks, but they're not expressing who they are. So their personality doesn't come across. Now, the rap artists and African-based forms always seem to come back to this expressing themselves. So you know the personalities of each rap artist or each hip-hop dancer and everything. They are expressing their personality some way or other in the dance, whereas it tends to be much less so when white people are doing the same form.
Interesting. So interesting, Kathy. Yeah.
Do we have any comments? Are any comments coming?
I'm gonna look. Let's look. Oh my goodness, here we go. So I try not to look at this so much because, you know, it's a little bit of a delay. So Jean July is here with us. Hi, Jean. She says, Wawanko to me is the woman having the power. And just people saying hi. We have, hi, Vanya is here with us.
Who?
Hi, Cynthia. We have people who have said hi to us who are listening. No. So Vanya is here. Vanya's from Brazil. And Cynthia is here from Los Angeles. Hi, Carlos. Hi, Claudia. And Jean is here, and Ronnie Padilla. Hi, everybody. Thank you for commenting. Does anyone have any questions that you'd like to ask Kathy, or any anything you would like us to, Kathy, rather, to expand on? We've covered a lot of material, and the time does fly by. So, Kathy, as I wait for people to write comments, do you want to tell us what you're up to now? What are you doing?
Well, as I say, I'm 77 years old with a artificial hip, and I had a concussion. And so one reason that salsa works for me is that I'm not going to fall down because my partner is going to hang on, you know, keep me upright. Right. So you make do. With age has to do with making do with what you got, which actually is a part and parcel of this whole conversation we've had. Is, you know, you make silk perks out of the sow's ear. So I go to salsa dances, and I'm also working with the Maracatu PDX. Maracatu is a Brazilian carnival form from northeastern Brazil, and so I've been working with them, but I'm not parading anymore much. A little bit if it's a short parade, but mostly I make the costumes, which is, you know, lots of good stuff in that costuming. And I keep myself busy, I'll tell you. Oh, and also the other thing is that older people often do is they go into the singing, because we haven't even mentioned that. We talked about the music, and oftentimes with the more African-based forms, it's just drumming, but it can be a whole orchestra. Right. And then there's the singing, which is most important. And that's one thing that older people can do, is sing. So I have, even though I was not born with a good voice, I'm really working on being able to, and it's learning the song material, and it's very specific, oftentimes very creative, but also very specific to, you got to stay within the form of the music.
Right.
You see, part of, you know, dancers can be a lot freer with improv because of space. And they're not going to run into each other, whereas musicians, they will run into each other in their tones, and so they have to kind of get more form. So this formlessness of the dance is not, it doesn't work out so well, you know. It's so anyway, I do some singing, not well, but I do it. And also the other thing that I've been doing is I took up writing fiction when I couldn't dance anymore. And I started writing fiction and kind of poetic reworking sometimes of stories, African stories, and then singing with it. So the idea of storytelling, and of course my great mentor here in Portland is Habiba Ado, because she is the minister of that. And African Ghanaian woman. And so anyway, I've been doing that where I try to build a story and include song with it, because it livens things up so much, you know, and it's the African way to include movement, singing, and music altogether.
One of the things that, you know, and I talk to your other students and people who are my friends, like Cynthia, Van Cleef, and Jessie, we always reflect on your teachings and how you taught us kind of, you know, based on this African inclusion, right? And how inclusive, like, to be, right? And how it's a community and a building event, you know, and then the conversation, you know, always kind of leans into how exclusivity, you know, and how there's this like separation in some of the European forms between the performer and the audience, right? So I've always appreciated that about you, about how you were able to kind of like bring the audience in, bring people in, you know, to your classes, that there was never a feeling of exclusion, you know, in your classes. And that there was always enough for everybody, and the more the merrier, you know, and I feel like that's the Kathy school of thought.
Well, I think I have to credit part of that. I mean, it comes, I've had so many dance influences starting from when I was a child, but the period of modern dance that where I was heavily involved in it, like in the 60s and 70s, was very much that also is that you taught people in class. You didn't just teach a sequence. You taught people to improvise in the class, and you had whole classes on how to improvise and whole classes on how to choreograph. And so the idea that everybody can create. And so I think that did influence me in my teaching.
Yeah.
Even when I wasn't teaching the African forms, which,
sure,
you know.
Do you want to share any memorable stories about your travels and any kind of carnival experiences?
Well,
I mean, I've heard, I you know, didn't go to Jamaica with you, but I did hear some stories about you in Jamaica.
Well, I wasn't in Carnival in Jamaica, but I'll tell you this, a moment in Carnival in Rio de Janeiro. So it was in 1983, and what impresses everybody about Brazilian participation in these carnivals is just the number of people involved.
Yes.
And so I had
to take a deep breath even thinking about it. I'm like, oh.
I mean, it is, you know, I've performed maybe in a large theater and all that, but I was ready to go out onto the track in my big group. It was Imperatriz Leopoldinense. It was the Escola de Samba that I was dancing with. And there were 3,000 people in our group, and we were performing for 100,000 people. And I'm thinking, this is so different from, you know, 10 people doing some choreography for 100 people in the audience, if they could get them there, or even performing in a major theater where people are sitting in their seats, and there's 1,000 people there and a handful of people on the stage. But just the scope of the participation, it was just breathtaking. And I was just, this is, so anyway, that was.
Right, and you have the sense, right, you're on a continent. Like my experience of Carnival before I experienced Carnival in Brazil was in Trinidad, you
Mhm.
know, which was also really overwhelming because the energy is so high, and it's the kind of energy where you don't need to eat, you don't need to drink, you don't need to sleep, and you don't know how you're going, you know, because
And the audience is all singing the songs and swaying with you and everything. So it's participatory, you know, everybody.
right. But it was not until I got to Brazil where I was like, you know, I realized the biggest difference for me in Carnival in these two places, Trinidad versus Brazil, which I mean, the two of the largest or maybe the most festive carnivals, right, on the planet, would you say? Carnival in Trinidad and Brazil?
Probably, yeah, just in terms of sheer numbers and resources
Resources.
put into it, yeah.
Right. Was just the fact of being on an island versus a continent.
Oh, I don't have anything to say about that because I didn't spend that much time in Trinidad to really get a feel for that.
But you did Trinidadian Carnival.
I actually did, I'm trying to think. I did, what is the musical thing before it? What is it called?
Panorama.
Panorama, yeah.
I
Mm-hmm.
think so.
But I've seen, you know, I've seen videos and I know, and they were prepping for the
Okay.
carnival. So I know that it is gargantuan.
Yeah.
And I never thought about it in terms of being an island because you're the one who's traveled around the island, just know more about the island than I do. So I can't comment on that. But so what was it for you? The difference between being on an island versus being in a huge country like Brazil?
Well, I think that I just had there was a moment when I was in Brazil because I just felt kind of like a carnival veteran at that moment because I was coming from many carnivals in Trinidad, and then I did the one in Brazil, and I remember having the differentiation between the two cultures when I was able to kind of look. There's times when you're in carnival and you get lifted up by the people because there's so many people that your feet aren't touching the ground, you know, it's like being at a concert. And so there was a moment where I got kind of lifted up, like kind of like the tide, right, in the ocean, and I got to see like above the crowd, and there was like a moment where I was like, get me out of here,
Yeah, right.
I had a slight panic attack.
Yes, it can happen. That's right. Yeah. Let's see. When you're talking, I flashed on something and I flashed right out of it in terms of this island versus, well, I've lost it. They both, okay. Oh, I know what I was going to say. In terms of Brazilian carnival, I see every time I was in a carnival experience in Brazil, it was in a large city. And many people told me, if you would, you know, that the experience of carnival in a rural community is much different because everybody knows everybody. They still do costumes. They still do, you know, they put on, they dance for each other and they have fun and they get drunk and do all that stuff. But they say it's different because it's the urban versus rural, which
Right.
of course this is world global now. We have such a divide between rural and urban cultures.
Right. Whew. Well, any other stories? Can you give us a Jamaica story? And you were in the Blue Mountains, right?
Yeah.
Can you tell us a story about being and in the Blue Mountains there's the Kumina, right?
They're not in the Blue Mountains. The Kumina.
Oh, I thought they were.
No, the Kumina are in the southeastern section of St. Thomas Parish in Jamaica, and they are in the cane fields, and still, you know, wall-to-wall cane fields. And very interesting because they came to Jamaica to work not as slaves because the British emancipated in 1830s. So they came as free indentured laborers. And they're very proud of that fact. So the Kumina culture really stresses this whole business of that they were never slaves, and they were able to keep their African culture more intact. Now you can dispute this, but this is the way they feel about it, and that's very strong. That they are proud of not having been enslaved, which tells a great deal about the shame that the people who were enslaved have felt. And we can't forget that, you know, that it was terrible, it was deadly, and it was forever in, you know, so many of the cultures. Whereas the Kumina culture, this was just 100 years ago, and well, it's not 100 now, it's a little bit more, but it's a recent development, mostly Congolese. The people who came in the Kumina culture in Jamaica were mainly from the Congo, and so it's the form that we recognize in all the different cultures, because Congolese was so pervasive in all these diasporan cultures.
Right.
But the fact that they stress this fact, and it isn't even a total fact, because in fact many of the people who live in St. Thomas Parish came from ancestors who had been enslaved, but they have adopted this belief or this stance that, you know, we come from Greek culture, and, you know, nobody can hold us down, and it makes a big difference.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I you know, this is probably opening up a big can of worms, and this is probably, I hope you'll come back so that we can talk more, because I know we just tried to keep it kind of narrow today, but there are so many other things that we could talk about. And I would love to have you on every week if possible.
Well, I want to hear from your other people. I'm looking forward to this.
So there's just comments, Kathy. Like, I think we've covered so much. Hi, Brian Davis. So we can see when people are watching, and we can see, so just a lot of comments. Cynthia from Los Angeles says, I drum more now due to my body not being like it was when I was younger. So she's also taken up drumming. Yeah. There's a comment about, someone asked movement healing techniques, ?
Well, that sort of gets like that conversation we had this morning about dancing for yourself.
Right.
And I said, well, this is not going to be dance therapy.
Right.
But of course, all of us who have been blessed to spend our life dancing know how therapeutic dance is. No matter how it's done, it's therapeutic. Right. But I can't address it in that form very well. I mean, I understand, and this goes into the religious, the sacred, that the African religions that stayed intact, changed, but stayed intact in many places in the Western Hemisphere. And so they have sacred events, and that's probably where you could say the healing and the connection, and people doing it for therapeutic reasons is probably the most obvious. But we all know that it's, you know, myself included, when I've had just this week, you know, I say, I'm going to go out salsa dancing and have a few beers and forget about all this, you know. So we certainly relate to that therapeutic aspect of dance, no matter what kind of, in my experience, every kind of dance was therapeutic. There was no bad dance. You know?
Right. Yeah, and I agree. Yeah, and he didn't really elaborate on what he was referring, what the reference was, but yeah, absolutely therapeutic. So I think, rewinding to what I was saying before when I said opening up a can of worms, but this is a question that comes up a lot. My students ask me this question quite a bit, and the question of Afro-Cuban dance and why and how it developed differently in Cuba versus the different colonies.
Oh, that's opening up.
And so I just would like to just get your opinion on that, because I have my own as well, and I'm sure ours align.
Well, there were just all the stars were aligned for Cuba. They've suffered greatly, but in terms of music and dance, I think they had a very strong influence of various African cultures that maintained in Cuba. It's an island of a large, talking about size, you know, it's a large enough island that there was a certain sort of density of people who were doing this. And so it was strong, we know, before the revolution, and it was very influential on other cultures. So wherever you go in Latin America, even in Brazil, but not as much in Brazil, mostly in around the Caribbean region and the United States, that Cuban music and dance had a great influence from way back before the revolution. The revolution had the priceless advantage of the culture. I mean, the revolutionaries said, we are going to elevate the African culture, which was not done in the other countries. You know, the African cultures were always, you know, and still are to a large degree, the ones who are not given respect. But in Cuba, there was governmental respect and resources put into maintaining, researching, maintaining, developing the arts and the folkloric arts, as well as the classical arts, or whatever you want to call them, the European forms. So they had, whatever they had, they were able to keep on developing. So I don't say, oh, they did, you know, you might say, well, okay, they have it so much there because they had people, they have artists on payrolls, you know, what a concept. But that isn't, yeah, right, it's cool. Very cool. Except now they don't, you know, they don't make enough money now. They have to do dance for the tourists. But the tourists are quite happy to come and take classes from them and pay them, and, you know, so it works for them. So it's both pre-revolutionary and post-revolutionary circumstances that made Cuba have such a brilliant array of forms, and to have those forms so influential. You know, I lived in Panama years ago, and so I went back and visited Panama. And down the street from me was a Cuban club, you know, in Panama. Everywhere you go, there is some little enclave of Cubans or some Cuban group. I went to Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I thought, well, okay, I'm not going to see. No, I was in Santa Fe. I can't remember. Someplace in, you know, New Mexico. And I heard this music. Went there, and there was a Cuban club dancing in the streets, you know, wherever you go. So, and part of it is, of course, their emigration. That they've had their own secondary diaspora from Cuba to all these different places in the Western Hemisphere, and wherever they go, including United States, and you and I are perfect examples. I mean, you know, this is where we've spent our time, is in the Cuban culture within the United States. And so, and a great assertiveness, you know, this is, I talked to older Cubans, you know, who were alive before the revolution, who were adults before the revolution. They're all gone now, you know, or mostly. So they, you know, and I would say, well, wasn't the revolution that made this so strong? They said, no, we were strong before. And I kind of think they're right, that it was, you know, this great pride and assertiveness and sort of, well, we are the center of where it's happening. you know, and so, you know, you might disagree with that, but they don't, and so that makes them very good at what they do, and very compelling, you know, as it becomes very compelling.
Right. Yep, that's pretty much my opinion too, Kathy.
That's not denigrating the others. I mean, Brazil is, you know, and a lot of Trinidad, you know, there's so many places that just have the most fabulous. Speaking of, you know, I was trying to think of other examples besides the Wawanko where there's this sort of outrageous seduction thing. And I remembered, I don't know that much about Peruvian dance, but this festejo is the Afro-Peruvian form. And within that, they have, one of the ways they do it is they have the woman has kind of a candle on her behind, and the man is running around trying to light the candle. You know, if that isn't just about as good as Wawanko in terms of being outrageous.
And this is Afro-Peruvian.
Afro-Peruvian, yes, because
okay.
Peru has three cultures. You know, it has the mountain culture, it has the city culture in Lima, and more Spanish, you know, and then it has the Afro-Peruvian, which is developed in the plantation area in the lowlands, and it's a very strong Afro-Cuban culture.
Right. Venezuela.
It's not Afro-Cuban, it's Afro-Peruvian, yeah.
Afro-Peruvian, and I mean, when I first started dancing with you, you know, we were doing Mexican folkloric dances from Veracruz, which also had the Afro-Cuban African influence.
Within Milagro, within
exactly.
Yeah.
Right. No, I mean, just saying the expansion of the diaspora.
Yeah. There was slavery in Mexico, a well-kept secret, you know, but there was slavery, and there was a big influence in earlier times, and then of course there's been because they're so close to Cuba, there's been a lot of, I was in the Yucatan a few years ago and went out to a Cuban club, and they were dancing it really well, and there weren't just Cubans dancing it really well, there were Mexicans dancing it really well, you know, so it's everywhere.
Aw. Kathy, okay, so we have Brian Davis says, can I read it to you? Sure. Kathy is the root of so much culture in Portland. Her dance required and inspired a bunch of us to study the music of Brazil, Cuba, Jamaica, Haiti, and much more. It provided me with a great job for years too.
Yeah, well, it was, he was the accompanist for forever at Portland State. I had the great advantage of having a professor's position at Portland State with a very well-developed dance program, and so I had resources and I had space, and we could write grants, and we could bring artists to Portland because of those factors. So I have to give credit that, you know, the universities always, or I shouldn't say always, because sometimes they decide they don't want to do folkloric, but when they do, and they did mainly because I said, we're going to do it, you know, and they said, why do you want to do that? I said, because it's good. And so, and you were part of that, the World Dance, weren't you one of the first people to be teaching in the World Dance Office? Yeah.
Right, and I'm actually at the house right now doing this interview at the founder of the World Dance Office, Cynthia Van Cleef, was formerly Cynthia Malloy. So yeah, Kathy, you raised us good.
Well, yeah, and Cynthia, she's probably listening, and so I can tell her that this Afro-Peruvian dance with the candle on the butt is very similar to, what's the one in Venezuela?
Is it called the tambor?
Yes, el tambor, yeah.
Tambor.
Yeah, or tambor, yeah. Tambor. Very similar in its style, where the hip movement is very much like that.
Okay. Okay, well, we have successfully talked for almost an hour. Kathy, good job.
Likewise, it was fun.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Your friend Kathy, Wendy Cochran's on, and she says hi, and she says Kathy is no joke.
I haven't seen Wendy in years. Wendy and I spent a time with some weeks in Tijuana that when, you know, the Cubans couldn't come to the United States, but they could come to Tijuana, and we would go down from California and have works that we were part of this fabulous workshop in Tijuana. So that's how I got to know Wendy, and we've dropped, I mean, so many people. I just don't travel that much anymore, and I don't go to California enough because it's the happening place in terms of these cultures.
She says, she says, remember Mestre Kingi at Stanford?
Yes. Yes, he just passed last year or something, right?
He did, yeah.
Yes, he was an inspiration to all of us, and he was the one
Afro-Brazilian, right?
Afro-Brazilian.
Yeah.
And he was the first that took it out of the temple because there was great resistance in Brazil to presenting the sacred material to the public, and I think he's one of the first ones who just sort of did it. And then it's still in Brazil, the attitude about the sacred dance as compared with the secular dance is much more a division than it became in Cuba, and that probably is due in part to the revolution, because they said, okay, religion is great, folklore, but let's not call it religion, let's just call it folklore. So I think they did a lot to bring the secular and the sacred realms together. But in Brazil, it's still controversial. Isn't that your experience? And I know you've been in the Viver Brazil. Maybe it's not that much anymore.
My experience was that it's not controversial. I was actually always so kind of, I mean, I will say that I've really only traveled to Bahia, you know, Salvador is really where where I would travel and I would go. So, I think that when I went to Brazil in the early 2000s was like the first time that I actually saw the presence of orishas like everywhere, you know, everywhere. Driving on the street, there's like, you know, there's a park and there's statues of the orishas like everywhere. Just how much it's been inserted into the popular culture there is what was my experience of the orishas.
Yeah, I forget that the last time I was in Brazil was 97, and I saw kind of a transformation where they sort of prepared Bahia for tourists, which needed some preparation because it was, you know, a pretty sketchy place before then, but that brought that out a lot more after that time. So it's probably just in the 21st century that they've really taken advantage of that for tourism, because before that, they, especially in Bahia, and you know, I would go around and I think, wow, there was so much potential here to earn money off of this. You know, we didn't even get into the whole economic thing about, you know, folklore. That's a whole other story.
Right.
But it's such a driving force, especially in Cuba today, because so many people have to use the arts as a means of gathering some money, you know.
Right. Yeah, I guess for me, I had been to Cuba and I had only kind of seen elements of, you know, the religious culture inside of people's homes. So like once you walked in the house, but I never, you know, you never really, or I wasn't exposed to it in the street, walking down the street, or so when I went to Brazil and like saw how it was everywhere, like the distinction was clear. But you know, Brian Davis just wrote again. He said, Kathy's work motivated me to go study with Mestre Kingi in Salvador.
Mm-hmm.
All the people that you inspired, Kathy, how does that make you feel?
Well, I mean, that's what teachers are supposed to do, right? I mean, the privilege of having a tenured position, then we better do something with it. So no, it was great, and had to do with also getting grants to do this kind of a thing. You know, I didn't do it all on my own. Because back in those days, there was some money for the arts. There isn't any more that I know of. Well, there's a little bit, but you know, it's compared to the way it was. It's pretty much dried up. But in those days, those are the flush days when universities taught culture as well as computer.
Right. Yeah, and I remember us having I don't know, you said you didn't remember you may or may not remember having this conversation with me, but about 5 years ago, you and I were talking, and I said, and you actually at this moment, you were writing your science fiction novels,
Mm-hmm.
and which are futuristic,
Mm-hmm.
and some of the things that you predicted in your book are actually happening.
Oh, let's not go there.
Okay, but I mean, so it's not so, I mean, science, it's not so fiction.
No.
That's what I'm trying to say. But, which is really interesting to me, just because, you know, of course you'd be a fantastic science fiction writer because, you know, you've always been our storyteller, you know, and so it just seemed like, well, of course, you know, this is how it's all going to happen, you know, for Kathy. But then, along the lines of futuristic, I asked you, so what's the future of dance? And you remember what you told me?
No.
You said everything is going to be digital.
Well, didn't I call it?
You did.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, and then here we are, you know, doing this live interview on Facebook. Mm-hmm. So, which is just, you know, I think, which is a whole learning curve, like for me, you know, because, you know, I was talking to you before we even started this interview. I'm like, I became a dancer so I wouldn't have to deal with all this stuff. And now here I am dealing with all this stuff.
Yeah.
But
I escaped it by getting too old and retiring and having a pension, so I don't have to learn it. I said, okay, I'm not gonna learn this. I've learned enough, you know, and I'll learn by consuming what I can get off the internet rather than producing on the internet.
Right. So we're trying to fill a gap here, which you've successfully done by, you know, putting some really great educational content, you know, out there for people to have access to people like you, you know, so.
And all they have to do is keep Googling. I mean, you know, YouTube has more than you can ever hold your eyes open for. That is just so fabulous these days.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Kathy. I don't want to say goodbye. Can we just hang up and then get back on?
Well, I'll see you. You're coming. No, you're not coming.
I am. I'm coming in August. I'll be in Portland in August. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, you know, the best time to be in Oregon.
Yes. Okay. Well, we'll have to get our calendars together on it. Thank you for inviting me.
I hope you come back. Will you come back, please?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. And tell all the people who are listening to this, I'm so glad that you listened and gave your feedback.
Look at all the comments. Well, I don't think you can see them, but there's so many comments.
Well,
there's so many people.
They can just put them online there and I can read them then, you know. I want to hear.
So this recording will live on my Facebook page, and I will be, if you're on my email list, I'm going to be emailing the link to this recorded interview that you could just click on, but it's also will live here.
So when will this, what we're doing right now, be on YouTube?
Well, it's not going to be on YouTube. It'll be on Facebook. With a recorded link. I'm sorry. With a link to the recording so that you can access it through a link.
Okay, I'll work it out. Well, when will that happen?
We'll work it out. Yeah, but it'll be available.
Pardon me?
It'll be available.
Okay, in days or hours or weeks or what?
Days.
Okay.
A few days. I will. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Kathy. And if you have any other questions after we've ended this and you're watching this as a replay, feel free to ask the questions. I will find a way, any excuse to talk to Kathy, and we'll find a way for Kathy to answer your question if something comes up after. Is that okay, Kathy?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Aloha, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you, Kimberly.
Ciao.
And Cynthia
Yes.
in the background there.